you can't miss, if you look at the news or anything, today is 9/11. And again, religious schools are starting all over the United States, including at Lev Learning, but it's also the month of Elul. And during Elul, we are supposed to look inwards and contemplate before the high holy days. And one of the things that helps you contemplate is hearing the shofar. And if I had really been on the ball, and maybe for next week, it'll still be Elul and I'll get a better shofar blower, but I have a shofar in my house, and I just wanted us to hear the sound as we begin in the month of Elul, and so excited about adult enrichment. Yeah. Not bad. I got the thumbs up from my family. I'll just review all of our what we do on Sunday morning. If you have a question, and Andrew's going to take questions, I'm sure, but you can raise your hand virtually. You can chat them. Let's let him speak. I'm going to have everybody muted except for him, and we will take it from there. And I'm really looking forward to this whole morning. So I'm going to also introduce him, but I'm going to make, there he is. And Ross, you're letting people in. Andrew Porwrancher. He is a native of Princeton, New Jersey, and earned degrees from Brown and Northwestern before completing his PhD in history at Cambridge. Currently, he serves as the Wick Carey Professor at the University of Oklahoma. He is the author of The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, winner of the Journal of the American Revolution Book of the Year Award and the Independent Publisher Book Award. So we can't wait to hear about all the things he's worked on and some of the things he will be working on. Andrew, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you to you and to your congregation for having me. I love being able to speak to Chicago audiences. I have such a soft spot for Chicago. She mentioned that I went to Northwestern. I'm actually the 14th person in my family to go to Northwestern, going back several generations. We have Chicago roots going back over 100 years, as I'm sure is true as many of your families. And my parents actually met in Evanston on the Northwestern campus. So it brings me a lot of naches, as we say in the old country, to be speaking with all of you today. And I'll look forward to sharing my story and then being able to answer some of your questions. So let us begin. Alexander Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a new Jerusalem. After the courts denied him his inheritance, his birthright, he had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic skills to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of wandering, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't really similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that in all likelihood, Hamilton himself was a Jewish immigrant. And uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins, it's not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his American adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Hamilton was Jewish, I need to begin by making the case that his mother was in all likelihood Jewish. And we know that his mother, Rachel, was not born a Jew. And so I have to demonstrate the likelihood that Rachel converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, St. Croix is part of the US Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it is there that Rachel meets and marries Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann Levine was Jewish, that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a non-Jew, still, she chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Hamilton scholars have long told us that Johann Levine is not Jewish because, supposedly, he's not identified in the Danish land records and census registers as a Jew. Well, it turns out, if you go through those records, and I learned enough Danish to read through them, I actually went through 3,000 of these records from the Caribbean, these scholars were right. Johann Levine is not identified in these records as a Jew, which would be problematic for my thesis today, had I not also uncovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in these records. Religion was not a category in these Danish documents. This has been the entire basis for denying Levine's Judaism for more than a century among Hamilton scholars, and it is divorced from historical fact. Well, what else do we know about Levine? Well, we know that his name was Levine. His name actually appears in a variety of spellings, including Lavian, Levin, Lewin, spellings that match, in many cases, letter for letter, how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. Levine worked as a merchant, a typical Jewish profession at that time. He was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews. And he had come from another Caribbean island, Nevis, with a large Jewish community. Most compellingly, Hamilton's own grandson identified Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. Conversely, there is no source identifying him as Christian. So if Johann Levine were in all likelihood Jewish, is it possible that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him? Well, consider this. Rachel and Johann have a son, Peter, who was born a year after their wedding. And this son is not infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Decades later, Peter Levine would move to South Carolina and he joins an Anglican church. But in order to join this church, he has to undergo an adult baptism. Well, Anglicans practice infant baptism. Why would they baptize an adult? Well, there's three possible reasons why Anglicans might baptize any given adult. One is the person grew up Christian, but they were baptized in a non-Trinitarian sect of Christianity. That is to say, Anglicans would accept a Trinitarian baptism from another denomination, a baptism in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, but they would not accept a non-Trinitarian baptism, which some Christian denominations practice. Could it be that Johann Levine actually grows up Christian, but in a non-Trinitarian sect? No, it's not possible because there were no churches on St. Croix in these years that were non-Trinitarian. Another possibility is, well, someone grows up Christian, but they're in a sect that does not practice infant baptism. They're in a sect that only practices adult baptism, or what's sometimes called believer's baptism. So is it possible that Johann Levine could have grown up Christian, but in one of these sects simply hadn't had as an adult baptism yet, and so he joins the Anglicans, now he needs to get a baptism? Again, this is not possible because every Christian denomination on St. Croix at this time exclusively practiced infant baptism. The third and final reason why Anglicans would baptize an adult, the only one that plausibly pertains to Peter Levine, is if they're converting to Christianity. Now, Hamilton scholars have been mired in the long-standing assumption that Johann, Rachel, and Peter were all cradle-to-grave Christians. And so they are baffled by Peter Levine's need for an adult baptism. But if Johann was actually Jewish and Rachel converted to Judaism to marry him, then that would make their son Peter a Jew, and his need for an adult baptism, this long time mystery among Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that is just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Now, Rachel and Johann have a deeply troubled marriage. He has her imprisoned for infidelity. And when she gets out of prison, she absconds from the island of St. Croix, leaving behind Johann and Peter. And she ultimately winds up on the British Caribbean island of Nevis, where she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, James unquestionably was a Gentile, but there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel raises her son Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. If he was born Jewish, we would expect that he would be circumcised. If born Christian, baptized. Unfortunately, there are no surviving circumcision records for any of the Jews on Nevis. There are, however, extant baptismal records which show no entry for Alexander. And even more compelling than that is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table so they would be eye level, and he would recite to her the 10 commandments in Hebrew. Now, I didn't discover these facts. Hamilton scholars have long known that there's no baptismal record. They've long known that he attended this Jewish school. How do they make sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. This is a very neat and tidy explanation, and one that might be problematic for my thesis had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through the church records and found that, in fact, children born out of wedlock were routinely infant baptized. We have precious little grounds for assuming that Hamilton's illegitimacy goes anyway towards explaining some sort of alleged rejection from church life, that it goes anyway towards explaining his enrollment in a Jewish school. Moreover, these Hamilton scholars make a critical error in assuming that a school for Jews would have accepted a child who was considered Christian. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to instill in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to inculcate in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their fellow Jews spread out across the diaspora. And there was a Talmudic prohibition, which many people interpreted to prevent Jews from teaching non-Jews the Torah. And so for all of these reasons, it would be remarkable to find a child who was considered Christian attending a school for Jews. In fact, it would be more than remarkable. It would be unprecedented. I have never discovered, and no scholar of 18th century Jewish history that I've ever met has ever discovered a single instance of a Christian child attending a school for Jews in this era anywhere in the world. Moreover, Hamilton scholars, in assuming that a Christian child attended a Jewish school, misunderstand the nature of Jewish-Christian relations in the Caribbean at this time. In the 18th century, and I want to take a couple minutes to unpack this part of the argument because it's central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. There are more Jews living on a single Dutch island in the West Indies at that time than in the entire continent of North America. Some of these Jews are, some of these islands are fully 40% Jewish. On Nevis, where Hamilton grows up, 25% of the free population is Jewish, right? These might not be Skokie numbers, but they're pretty respectable. So why are there so many Jews on these Caribbean islands? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for growing sugar, the ultimate cash crop of the 18th century. So lucrative was the Caribbean sugar trade that Britain generated more wealth from its collection of tiny West Indian islands than from all of its North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to choose between giving up one small sugar-producing island in the Caribbean or all of Canada. And they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers, I should say, that were willing to tolerate some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies stood to profit for that tolerance. And so religious diversity, to the extent that we see it in places like Nevis, it's not celebrated by the British. It is begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of Jews and other minority faiths was always precarious, especially as islands reached peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Jews are often accused of stealing bread from the mouths of Christian children through supposedly deceptive Jewish trading practices, which I might add is highly ironic because Jewish success in commerce was predicated on their trustworthiness, on their ability to secure credit in a world where credit was scarce. Jews, their success in commerce, it was perceived to come at the expense of Christians. Jews are easy scapegoats in troubled economic times. The geography of Jewish life in Charlestown, which is the main port town where Hamilton grows up on Nevis, that geography underscores how Jews occupied a separate and subordinate rung on the island hierarchy. Jews were not dispersed evenly throughout Charlestown. They were concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter on the island, it's not the most desirable real estate. It is sandwiched between a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on one side and the jail on the other. In other words, Jews and Christians, they're not coming to Nevis and creating a whole new set of spatial and social relationships between the two faith groups. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world, patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, cultural, religious, and geographic between Jewish and Christian life. The site of the parish church in Charlestown underscores this premium on religious division. Now, in many places in Europe, synagogues and churches had to be maximally distant from each other. In Nevis, there is no such requirement on the books, and yet they choose to adhere to this convention anyway, underscoring the staying power of these cultural mores that prize a division of Jewish and Christian life. Why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the fraught tenor of the Jewish experience on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that the Jews of Nevis would have educated Alexander Hamilton unless they considered him one of their own. The stakes for Jews were too high. Their continued residence on Nevis too doubtful. The politics with their Christian neighbors too dicey for the Jews to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. Now, Hamilton lives on Nevis until about the age of 11. And at that point, he and his mother wind up on the Danish island, St. Croix, where she had come from. Rachel runs a store out of the first floor of a building, and they live together on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple of years until February 1768, when Rachel Levine and Alexander both fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Alexander pulls back from the brink, but Rachel on February 28th, I'll double check I think it's February 19th. I'll double check the date. she takes her dying breath. And the details of her passing and burial are revealing for our purposes today. For one, Rachel is buried under the name Levine. She had not seen Johann for 18 years, and yet she keeps this Judaic surname until her dying day, further hinting at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Interestingly, she is not buried in the church cemetery. Now, a cemetery burial in a Jewish cemetery is not an option on St. Croix. St. Croix does not have the large Jewish community of some of these other islands. Your only option if you're Jewish was to be buried at your sister's, or I should say any relative's estate. Rachel indeed is actually buried at her sister's estate. And interestingly, Rachel's death is recorded in a church register, which Hamilton scholars have taken to mean seemingly reasonably that she must have been a member of that church. But what these scholars don't realize is that states don't start keeping civil records of deaths until the 19th century. In the 18th century, states are often using church records as de facto civil records. And so churches are sometimes recording Jewish deaths for state purposes, especially in places where there are too few Jews to have a synagogue maintaining its own records. A number of Hamilton scholars mention that a Christian clergyman presided over Rachel's funeral. And this too might be problematic for my thesis today, except there's not a shred of evidence to support this claim. If you look at all the Hamilton biographers through the generations who suggest a Christian clergyman presided over her funeral rites, and you go to the endnotes, they all just cite other Hamilton scholars saying the same thing. It's wholly circular. It is yet one more example of the mythology that continues to shroud our understanding of Alexander Hamilton's earliest years and kin. So if Alexander, in all likelihood, does grow up Jewish, when does he start identifying as Christian? I suspect that any Jewish identity Hamilton might have had dies with his mother. At this point, he's no longer living on Nevis, home to the large Jewish community that had educated him. His mother is gone. His familial and communal ties to Judaism would have been severed. A youth as plucky and precocious as Alexander Hamilton would have been disinclined to compound his troubles as a penniless orphan with a second-class religious status. But as we will see, no other American founder would do more to make the promise of equality real for America's Jews. Hamilton never forgets his origins. But before we move on to his American life, there is, it turns out, yet more evidence from the Caribbean testifying to a likely Jewish identity for Alexander Hamilton. There is a recently unearthed court transcript from his teenage years that lends credence to my theory that he is identifying as a Christian in the Caribbean before he comes to America, but it also lends credence to my theory that he was a relative newcomer to the Christian faith. So from the time of his mother's death when he's 13 until the time Hamilton comes to America when he's 18, he's living on St. Croix. And during these years, he is called when he's 17 years old to give testimony in a legal case. And he's put on the witness stand and he's asked, in an assessment for his competency to swear on the Christian Bible, how do you identify religiously? He says, I'm Anglican. And then they say, well, you've taken communion then? And Hamilton admits that no, he's never taken communion. Well, this is a real oddity because the Book of Common Prayer, which governs Anglican rites, specifies that the paired rituals of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. Here's Hamilton as a 17-year-old, an adult by the standards of the day, who's never taken communion. It is such a curiosity. It is so unusual that the judge forbids him from giving sworn testimony. He has insufficient Christian bona fides. Hamilton's life continues in the Caribbean, working for an import-export company. And I'll mention just as an aside, if you think about other American founders who grow up on plantations, on farms, they're versed in an agrarian form of economy. Hamilton grows up working for this import-export company. In these crucial formative years, he's learning about debt, finance, credit, maritime trade, currency. He is honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future. And given the prominence of Jewish traders in the Caribbean, it is all but certain that Hamilton comes into contact with precisely the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'll later collaborate in creating the American financial system. Hamilton continues in this role until August of 1772, when a catastrophic hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. Amid the twin horrors of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes are reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders summarily extinguished. The best surviving depiction we have of the storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's eloquent description of surviving the storm is published in a local island paper, and according to lore, islanders are so taken by his precocious facility with language that they raise money to send him to America for college. And when Hamilton comes to New York, he enrolls at King's College, what we now know as Columbia, and Hamilton does something really interesting when he arrives in America. He lies about his age. Every piece of evidence that we have from the Caribbean, including Hamilton's own testimony in the aforementioned court case, places his year of birth in 1754. But when he gets to America, he claims to have been born in 1757. Why would Hamilton lie about his age? Well, the average student at King's College at that time who's entering is only about 15. King's College skews young. It would be unsurprising if Hamilton, the outsider, the West Indian, the orphan, eager to fit in, would fudge his age so he seemed like the same age as other incoming students. Hamilton is diminutive in stature. He's boyish in face. He only looks like he's about 15, making the deception that much easier to carry out. This charming fabrication on Hamilton's part is revealing for our purposes today. It tells us that, one, he was willing to conceal some foundational aspect of his Caribbean past, like his year of birth. And two, even more importantly, he was able to get away with it for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary ever exposing his falsehood. What Hamilton probably didn't think through is that if you get to New York and you lie about your age, then for the sake of consistency, he's going to have to maintain that fiction for the rest of his life. And he does so without anyone from the West Indies ever coming forward and outing him as a prevaricator about his year of birth. This makes it that much more plausible that Hamilton would have been perfectly willing and perfectly able to obscure a Jewish heritage from his American contemporaries. Let us take a step back and take stock of the evidence that we've seen. I realize the notion that an American founder may have been a closet Jew might seem a little outrageous at first blush. There are people in corners of academia who will tell you Porwrancher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. Well, I take comfort in the words of one of Hamilton's rivals, John Adams, who once said famously, "Facts are stubborn things." So let's take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, conducted business with Jews, had come from an island with a Jewish community, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. After he marries Rachel, they have a son, Peter Levine, who is not infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. He gets an adult baptism under circumstances that only make sense if he's converting to Christianity. And she has this other son, Alexander, for whom we also have no baptismal record, and whom she enrolls in a Jewish school at a time when Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children. She keeps the surname Levine until her dying day. She's not buried at the churchyard cemetery. And Alexander, when he's 17, is called to give testimony, admits that he's never taken communion, which would be an oddity for someone that age if they'd actually grown up Anglican. And then when he gets to America, he proves perfectly willing and perfectly able to conceal foundational aspects of his Caribbean youth. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith that these people were all cradle to grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. As my mother likes to say when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. And I don't know where she got that expression. She's a Jew from Montreal. I don't think she's ever been south of Philadelphia, but she did somehow pick up this deep South saying. I realize the notion that Hamilton may have been a closet Jew seems on its face a little outlandish, but my book proceeds from the foundational premise of all research, which is that the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. Now, I know that we've got a smart crowd. I've spoken in Chicago. We got educated community there, and you may have cultivated such a healthy sense of skepticism that you're thinking, you know what, Porwrancher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about a historical figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a bunch of reasons. For one, Hamilton himself maintained a lifelong silence about his Caribbean origins. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about your Jewish roots would have been prudent, to say the least. Hamilton's scholars have largely followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his earliest years. Their principal interests lie in the extraordinary events of his American adulthood. The task of recovering the esoteric details of Hamilton's upbringing, it's not just a relatively peripheral endeavor, it's also a very recent one. Even a fact as basic as his mother's name remained unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise then that his religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. What's more, if you want to write about Hamilton's adulthood, all of his letters and essays and publications have been collated into a 17-volume published collected works of Alexander Hamilton, available in most any major library. You could write an excellent biography, just focus on Hamilton's adulthood without ever leaving the Northwestern University library. But if you wanted to write about his childhood, you're looking at documents that are scattered across remote Caribbean islands and the European capitals of the countries that colonized those islands. And these documents appear in an astounding array of languages, not just Danish, but also Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese. The onerous task of recovering Hamilton's obscure details from his childhood is hardly worth the painstaking effort for the typical Hamilton biographer whose native tongue is English and whose principal interests lie in the Constitutional Convention or the American Revolution. And so vital facts about even a renowned historical icon can remain overlooked for centuries. The notion that we may have missed something major about an American founder shouldn't strike us as terribly remote or unlikely. Consider, by way of analogy, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. For centuries, rumors that Jefferson fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings were lent little to no credence. Only in the last generation has a pioneering scholar, Annette Gordon-Reed at Harvard, done new research when combined with DNA testing has led to a new consensus. among Jefferson scholars that he almost certainly did father children with Sally Hemings. Similarly, Hamilton's Jewish origins are no less real for having escaped our attention for so long. And so I might just ask quickly, Vanessa, how much longer do you want me to speak for? Because I can tailor this to however you want.
We can go till 11:15 today. So I would say, we're into the story. I don't see any questions. We got to hear the story.
Okay. I'll go for about
The
another
history. The history.
Yeah, no, this is great. I'll go for another, 15 minutes or so. And maybe I'll just take this quick opportunity to show people the book cover, which I'll just mention very briefly, available at your local bookstore. They can order it in for you if they don't have it, Amazon. If you're interested in the full story with all the texture and depth and richness of historical detail. Okay.
It's a great book. It's a great book.
Thank you so much. Hamilton, as mentioned, does not identify as a Jew in his American adulthood. And yet, no founder does more to help realize this promise of equality for American Jewry. Hamilton's advocacy for American Jews, and this in an age when anti-Semitism had mainstream purchase on political life, it assumes a variety of forms. Hamilton, as an alumnus of King's College, is instrumental in implementing reforms that are friendly to Jews. So the college shuts down during the war. After the revolution, they reopen the college and they rename it from King's to Columbia. You can't fight a war against a monarch and then have your alma mater called King's. It would be unseemly. So they give it what seems like a solid American name. They call it Columbia, as it's still known today in New York City. And Hamilton, as an alumnus, helps change the college charter so that Jews are eligible for the college presidency. Now, if you look at other colleges with colonial era roots, like Brown, where I went, like Rutgers in my home state of New Jersey, these colleges don't open their college presidencies to Jews until the 20th century. Hamilton's 150 years ahead of his time. He also does away with mandatory forms of Christian worship for undergrads. And this is pretty striking given that all undergrads are Christian. Perhaps he's imagining a world where there will be a Jewish undergraduate student body contingency. Hamilton also puts the first Jew on the board of an American college. We had higher education in the New World since the founding of Harvard in the 1630s, and yet never before had a Jew sat on the college board. Hamilton puts the Hazan, effectively the rabbi of Shirith Israel, the local community, the local Jewish congregation, onto the Columbia board. There would not be another Jew on the Columbia board until the 20th century. And by the way, it's a name that many of you will know, especially any lawyers in the audience will know, Benjamin Cardozo, who's most famous for being the second Jew on the Supreme Court after Louis Brandeis. He's also the second Jew after Gershom Satius to sit on the Columbia board. He's always the second Jew to do something. Cardozo is the ultimate Jewish silver medalist. Now, Hamilton, we see here yet again, 150 years ahead of his time. In addition to Hamilton's role implementing Jewish-friendly reforms at his alma mater, he is best remembered, of course, for his role as being our first Treasury Secretary at a time when the fate of the Republic was far from certain, when shoring up America's financial health was essential to creating the economic foundation on which our political experiment in self-government might well endure. Hamilton, as a 35-year-old, is tapped to become George Washington's Treasury Secretary, and he sets into motion a grand vision of American finance that was so forward-looking, most of his contemporaries couldn't begin to grasp his prescience. His adversaries routinely reach for the cudgel of anti-Semitism in a bid to derail Hamilton's far-seeing economic agenda. They accuse him of being engaged in some sort of unholy alliance with allegedly rapacious Jews who were trying to bilk ordinary farmers and veterans and soil tillers. They rely on these long-standing tropes from European history. Now, despite this contentiousness, despite this opposition, Hamilton doesn't waver in his alliance with American Jewry. It is striking that although Hamilton is identifying as a Christian, arguably no one else in early America is subjected to more anti-Semitism than is Hamilton because of the resistance to his financial agenda. But it is in Hamilton's legal career where we see most vividly his abiding commitment to civic equality for American Jews. Although he's best remembered for his financial role in New York circles, Hamilton was equally renowned as the city's premier litigator. He was the go-to lawyer for New York's Jewish community. And it is in this role where Hamilton most forcefully advances a vision of religious equality. And I'll share just one vignette in particular. Hamilton, with a couple years left in George Washington's administration, decides to leave the administration, even though he's the second most powerful person in the government, second to only Washington himself. And he moves back to New York and he goes into private legal practice. Now, it was the case at that time, and it's still true today, that if you're a talented lawyer, you can do a lot better for yourself in the private sector than you can working for the government. Hamilton has growing debts. He has a growing family. And so he's able to triple or quadruple his salary overnight by going into law. And it is in this role as a lawyer where Hamilton takes on what proves to be the hardest case of his legal career. And it's a difficult case for many reasons. For one, Hamilton's client is a French merchant living in New York City who's accused of fraud. And this at a time when it was widely feared that America and France might be on the brink of war. So a merchant from a hostile foreign power accused of fraud in his business dealings, it's not the most sympathetic of plaintiffs Hamilton could have represented. The opposing party is two of New York's most respected businessmen. And those businessmen are represented by none other than Gouverneur Morris. Now, Gouverneur Morris, not a household name today, but he was at that time one of the luminaries of the early republic. He had served in the Continental Congress in the 1770s. He authored the famous We the People preamble to the US Constitution in the 1780s. He served as a diplomat under George Washington in the 1790s. And most problematically for Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris could be a devastatingly effective orator in a courtroom. And if all of that were insufficient to convince you this was going to be the hardest case in Hamilton's career, he finds out that his co-counsel is Aaron Burr. And this at a time when they are not on great terms. And there's one more detail you need to know. Hamilton's principal witnesses were Jews. And this at a time when it was widely and erroneously believed that the Jewish faith actually encourages Jews to lie under oath in court. This is an absurd and deeply anti-Semitic stereotype that had deep roots in European history that had migrated over to the New World. Now, this case over a period of years gets litigated on appeal up to the highest tribunal in the state of New York, called the Court of Errors. It doesn't exist today. We have nothing like it today because it combined all three branches of government. So the members of the state Senate, the justices of the state Supreme Court, and the Attorney General would all sit together as a jury. And whoever got the most votes would win their case. Now, Hamilton, or I should say, actually, Gouverneur Morris, in his closing argument before the Court of Errors, resorts to a base attack on Hamilton's witnesses. Morris alludes to them as, quote, these Jew witnesses, and says flatly, and I quote, Jews are not to be believed upon oath. The next day, a large crowd gathered in the gallery to see how Hamilton, ever the relentless fighter, would respond. What Hamilton understood was that this case had become about something more than just a dispute between merchants. At stake was the very meaning of the Republic. The question of whether justice would be blind to religion spoke to the heart of the revolution and its radical promise of equality. The fact that a statesman as revered as Gouverneur Morris had resorted to scoring political points using anti-Semitism suggested that perhaps the inspired rhetoric of the revolution was little more than a facade masking discrimination. But Hamilton would not so readily relinquish his dream of equality in the nation he fought to create. In Hamilton's own closing argument, he points to Gouverneur Morris and says, has he forgotten what this race once were when under the immediate government of God himself, they were selected as the witnesses of his miracles and charged with the spirit of prophecy? Were not the witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith? Hamilton goes on to say that no one should be judged because of the manner in which they worship. In Hamilton's own words, and I quote, "Be the injured party, Jew or Gentile, Christian or pagan, foreign or native, justice clothes him in her mantle, in whose presence all differences of faith and birth, passions and prejudices, all are called upon to acknowledge and revere justice's supremacy." My friends, it can be all too easy for us to overlook in our modern time the extraordinary character of these remarks after Jews had suffered the contempt of all ages and all nations. Here was a founding father demanding that in an American courtroom, a Jew and a Gentile stand equal before the law. Here is where we find the promise of the revolution made real. Here is where we find the radicalism of Alexander Hamilton. When the final tally came in from the Court of Errors by a vote of 28-6, Hamilton emerges victorious. Let me say in closing a brief word about what I see as the striking parallels between the story of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own. The Jewish tradition teaches us that Jews are robbed of the land that God promised Abraham. Amid the resulting diaspora, Jews are outsiders in other lands. In societies where power was rooted in land, Jews could not own land. Jews had to become intermediaries, tradespeople between societies who cultivated linguistic and financial acumen by virtue of their marginality. So it was with Alexander Hamilton. He too knew what it meant to be an outsider. He too developed skills in languages and in commerce in order to survive. He too came to America in the hopes that this new republic could be his new Jerusalem. Hamilton once said of the Jewish people, and I quote, "The progress of the Jews has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one, that it is the effect of some great providential plan?" Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention at play in his own unlikely journey from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. It was precisely because Hamilton and his Jewish allies were outsiders that they were able to become consummate modernizers. In a world that was largely rural, they flocked to urban life. In a world that was primarily agrarian, they were drawn to trade and finance. In a world where loyalties often lay with their local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish compatriots believed in the promise of a unified American nation. It has been said that if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go down to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and there you will find, carved from white marble, a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. But if you want to see a monument to Alexander Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the future that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the America of tomorrow belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats. It belonged to the immigrant. It belonged to the urban. It belonged to the cosmopolitan. It belonged to the enterprising, to the commercial, to the entrepreneurial, to the multilingual. It belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish allies. If Jews were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you.
Wow, that's all I can say. I feel like I, should get up and do something. And I can say that we're all glad that we were in the room where it happened. And I'm, as the moderator, I'm going to start off with a couple questions. Before Lin-Manuel Miranda made Hamilton very famous, we knew he was on the $10 bill. What made you go into this research? Because obviously your research is deep and in depth, and sounds amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind comments. This is a project that really grew out of my classroom teaching. I was brought to the University of Oklahoma to teach constitutional history, and I love to bring in biographical details of the historical figures whom I write about. And what was so striking about Hamilton was that he had this mother named Rachel Levine, and she enrolled him in this Jewish school. And Hamilton's scholars mentioned these details, but sort of glossed over them. And I thought, well, for anyone else, this would be prima facie evidence of a Jewish identity. And so I started to dig through archives, got grants to go to repositories in the Caribbean, in Europe. And it turns out that all of these long-standing assumptions wither under scrutiny when you actually weigh these articles of faith that have been peddled by Hamilton scholars against the evidence in the historical record. So as is the case with a lot of scholars, while our research interests drive what we teach in the classroom, oftentimes we find what we teach in the classroom informs our research interests. And so had I not become a professor, I don't think I would have ever pursued this project. And so in some respects, I have my students to thank for it. So thank you for that question.
Okay. If people have questions, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat. Go ahead, Sandra or Mark.
Hi. What was his church life like with his wife in New York? Was he an avid churchgoer? Did he not go at all? What was his relationship like with the church?
This is a really great question, and it's one I address in more depth in my book. Hamilton is nominally identifying as a Christian. Interestingly, he chooses for a wife in Elizabeth Schuyler, a very pious Christian. And yet he never joins her church, Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan. He gets a pew for her and their children. But if you look at the communion records from Trinity Church, as I have, you see her name in there. You don't see his name. And even when he's laid down on his deathbed with Aaron Burr's bullet in his spine, Hamilton had still never taken communion. And there's a lot of scholarly intrigue about Hamilton's final hours, because during his adulthood in America, he's not attending church. Some contemporaries don't consider him Christian for that reason. And yet on his deathbed, he asks finally to take communion. Now, there's a couple different ways of reading this deathbed communion. One is that, here's someone who had kept this measured distance from Christian life and suddenly finds Jesus in his waning hours. Another explanation that I think would be more in line with the rest of the evidence we have is that Hamilton is asking for communion precisely because his wife is pious. And he knows that if he takes communion at this final moment, it will offer her some small measure of solace amid the grief about to envelop her life. Now, the rector of Trinity Church doesn't want to give Hamilton communion because he has no history of being engaged with the church. And he doesn't want to give this last minute 11th hour grace after a lifetime of being disengaged from organized Christian life. But ultimately the rector gives in and gives Hamilton communion. What's really interesting is that both Hamilton's admirers and his detractors described his deathbed communion as a departure from his usual detachment from Christian practice. So his admirers say, who are Christians, say, oh, thank goodness, he finally takes communion. Death effaces all else in his life. He finally dies a Christian. And then his detractors are like, he's a total hypocrite. He only takes communion at the last minute. There's nothing genuine about it. Decades later, the history gets rewritten with Hamilton being supposedly having embraced some sort of more devout form of Christianity in his later years, not just in his last moments. But that depiction, which was promoted by one of his children in a project written specifically for his devout mother, is inconsistent with the contemporaneous evidence we actually have from the time of Hamilton's death. So thank you very much for that question, because I think it throws into relief Hamilton's detachment from Christian life. It could be he's just not that engaged a Christian. It could be the residue of a Jewish origin story.
Oh, what are we sharing here, Ross? I'm not.
That's Trinity Church, and that's Alexander Hamilton's grave. So
There we go.
It's just around the corner from the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, it is.
And I walked by it. I had a client in New York. I walked by it every day for about 9 months.
Yeah, interesting. And there's certainly nothing Christian about that grave. There's no cross. There's no nothing on it. I have another question. What is your pushback from your other scholarly colleagues on your thesis?
Yeah, it's a good question. The pushback has been intense, and also, happily for me, sort of divorced from evidence. So I'll share with you the sort of like major buckets of pushback that I get. So one bucket is people who want to engage in gatekeeping Jewish identity. What my book argues is that Hamilton is Jewish in some sense of that term for some stretch of his life in all probability. And so I lay out an 8-part schema of Jewish identity. So there's personal Jewish identity. Do I think of myself as Jewish? There's communal identity. Does my Jewish community see me as Jewish? Public identity. Does the larger Gentile community understand me to be a Jew? Devotional identity. Do I adhere to the devotional obligations of Judaism? Ethnic identity. Do I descend from the ancient Israelites? Halakhic identity. Am I the son of a Jew? Have I converted to Judaism? Cultural identity. And many people throughout history, especially the 18th century Caribbean, are Jews in some senses of this term and not others. And so by complicating what it means to be Jewish, I am threatening the gatekeeping function that some people want to play around who gets to be Jewish and who doesn't get to be Jewish. I am not making a theological claim about Jewish identity. I am speaking as a historian about who was seen as Jew and by what standards. And so I'm not making any normative claim about who should be considered Jewish. I'm making a descriptive claim about who was considered Jewish on their own terms in their own time. And so people who want to gatekeep Jewish identity can get exercised about my book. Another bucket of people are concerned that I'm giving fodder to right-wing anti-Semites, that I'm giving fodder to extremists, to neo-Nazis who hate Jews, they hate Wall Street, and they're like, oh, the patron saint of Wall Street was actually a closet Jew. This is perfect. By their logic, it is incumbent on me to not give fodder to these people, to obscure from the public historical evidence, to hide facts from public view, because I'm afraid that bigots will use my book as a distorted echo chamber for their own prejudicial views. Well, I am not afraid. It is my only job to be faithful to the evidence. It is my only job to shed light on the truth. I cannot hide back facts from public view because of my fear that they will get twisted by bigots, or the answer to bigotry is not to hide information and hide knowledge. It is to try to meet people in the marketplace of ideas and to fight falsehood with truth. That's what I'm going to try to do in this book. That's what I'm going to continue to try to do. People, I think, are also territorial. I'm someone who comes to Jewish history from legal history. I'm someone who comes to the Caribbean Jewish experience, having studied America previously. And some people want to dismiss me as some sort of dilettante who doesn't really have a background in this field. And he steps in being new to Caribbean Jewish history, and all of a sudden he's getting all this attention for his book. So it's not really his field. Ultimately, it is incumbent on other scholars to engage my argument on its own merits, and to judge me by the claims that I make and whether they fit the evidence, not based on whether this is my first book or my fifth book on Caribbean Jewish history. Every source that I cite in support of my argument concerning Hamilton's Jewish identity, this was not true when I started the book. It is true now. All of that material is now digitized. Anyone can go to any footnote in my book and fact check me on any constituent claim that makes up my larger claim, and I would welcome that scrutiny. So for all of these different reasons, a lot of people get worked up about the book. Some people suggest, oh, well, Hamilton didn't go to a Jewish school, really. He just had a teacher who happened to be Jewish, and we know it's not a Jewish school because his teacher was a woman, and women couldn't teach at Jewish schools until the 19th century, and this is the 18th century. So the very fact that she's a woman shows it couldn't have been a Jewish school. The problem with this is that there is a rich literature documenting the involvement of Jewish women in Jewish education going back to the 16th century. You can find numerous examples of women, especially in frontier Jewish communities. You see a renegotiation of gender roles. You find examples of women who are serving as sextons in congregations where there's not enough men to fill these roles. And so actually, it's not surprising at all that we might find a woman involved in that. People also say, oh, well, Levine's not really a Jewish name in the 18th century, so he wasn't really Jewish. It's only a Jewish name in the 19th century. The problem is that argument ignores the fact, as I point out in my book, that his name actually appears under the names Lavian and Lewin and Levin more commonly in the historical record. And those names actually do match how Jews of Levitic descent were spelling their surnames in the 18th century. A lot of my critics are also prone to describe my book as overstating the claim that, oh, Porwrancher seeks to prove that Hamilton is Jewish, to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt he's Jewish, and the claim falls short of certainty. And so that's a criticism of the book. The problem is the notion that the claim is short of certainty. It's not a criticism of my argument. It is my argument. At every turn in the book and in this talk, I frame my claim probabilistically. And so the fact that my critics have to set up a straw man, have to claim that I'm proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's Jewish, they set up an impossible hurdle that I never try to clear and then fault me for failing to clear it. And so ultimately, the real question is, why is it that so many people are sufficiently unnerved by the notion that Hamilton could be Jewish that they have to seek to distorting my book in a bid to debunk it? What is motivating people to try to deplatform me? There has been a concerted effort to prevent venues from having me speak. There has been an effort to get me disinvited from various venues, not from your synagogue, I should say, at least to my knowledge.
No.
Some of these venues have pushed back and they've hosted me. Some of them have disinvited me. There are people out there who never wanted you to see the evidence that's in this book, that never wanted you to even have the chance to make up for yourself, to make up your own mind, whether my argument follows from the evidence. They've wanted to take that choice away and make the decision for you that you shouldn't get to hear this book. There was a concerted effort to try to ensure that this book would never be published. But the book was published. I am giving this talk, and the journey continues. And so I'm grateful to synagogues like yours. I'm grateful to places like Princeton University Press for giving me an opportunity to share this story.
Well, we're certainly glad that you could share it. A couple comments in the chat. Carol said Denmark has always been known as tolerant, and you said that sugar and profits were important, and pretty much the standard. So Hamilton, could have been part of that. Jay messaged me and said, there's a Bloomberg interview. The speaker has an interesting anecdote about Hamilton and the fast of Tammuz. So, maybe we can unearth even more interesting facts. I would be remiss if I did not ask you, what are you working on now?
That's a really good question. And I'll tell you, I'm actually working on sort of three different things, and maybe I'll describe each of them hyper briefly. But one is a new book that's just come out called The Prophet of Harvard Law, which is about this professor named James Bradley Thayer that no one's heard of, but I argue he's actually one of the most important figures in American legal history because he mentored a number of judges, including many prominent Jews, who would go on to become some of the most eminent judges in Supreme Court history and the history of the federal branch, including people like Louis Brandeis. Felix Frankfurter idolized Thayer. Frankfurter, in a sense, actually sort of abandons his Jewish identity and turns Thayer into sort of a secular prophet. And so this is a new book that's out. It should be especially if you have a lawyer in your life who might be interested in, who likes to read legal biography. I try to tell a human story, and it's also got some Jewish history in there. I'm also working on a project with Princeton University Press called Theodore, Roosevelt, and the Jews. And oh yeah, there you go, The Prophet of Harvard Law. So I actually co-authored this book with 3 students of mine. So it's a book by a professor and his former students about a professor and his former students. So it was a real pleasure to work on this book. Yeah. Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. This is a story about the president who comes to power in the first decade of the 20th century at precisely the moment when the plight of Eastern European Jewry makes global headlines. And Jewish causes become central to Roosevelt's diplomacy and his presidency in a way that he could have never imagined. And yet there is arguably no president who was better situated to take the helm of American statecraft in this moment of Jewish suffering, because Roosevelt comes from New York City at a time when New York City is quickly becoming 28% Jewish. Roosevelt, as a young 30-something police commissioner, is walking the streets of the Lower East Side, recruiting Yiddish-speaking police officers and giving speeches block by block to new Jewish immigrants. And so by the time Roosevelt gets to the presidency, he is uniquely prepared to shepherd America through this unique and fraught moment in Jewish history. And the last project that I'm working on, which is still in early stages, is tentatively titled The Great Jewish Lunacy Trial. And this is a book about a Quaker in the 19th century from Philadelphia who was made America's first ever diplomat to Jerusalem. And when he's in Jerusalem, he converts to Judaism. And when he gets back to the United States, his family petitions the state to file charges of lunacy against him for having converted to Judaism. And if he's found guilty of being a lunatic, he's going to be confined to a lunatic asylum for the rest of his life. And so this case becomes a momentous test case for religious freedom in America. And he is found guilty at first, and then in the subsequent trial, which gets national attention, he is acquitted, and he ends up moving back to the Holy Land. And Herman Melville, the great American author, meets him and writes a 500-page poem based in part on his encounter with this character. So it's sort of diplomatic history meets the history of religious freedom meets literary history. So I'm currently applying for grants and fellowships to help fund that research, but a bunch of different coals in the fire.
All right. Well, Andrew, it's been a fabulous morning. And we, I hope if you're in Chicago, we can have you back in person or have you back on Zoom. What a great morning. I want to thank everyone. And I just feel we have to learn more and continue that research and look into all the things that Andrew's doing. So Shavua Tov to everyone. Have a good week. If you have any questions during the week, you know where to get me. Great seeing everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Buy the book. Buy the book. Go out and buy the book. Or on Kindle.
Great session.
Thank you.
Perfect.